Welcome to our video on the Great Heathen Army, a massive Viking force that invaded England in the late 9th century, formed in response to the growing power of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in England, which posed a threat to Viking interests in the region. The Great Heathen Army first arrived in England in 865 when a Viking force landed in East Anglia and began raiding nearby towns and villages. Known for its brutal tactics, including surprise attacks, raids, and the use of terror tactics to intimidate local populations, they were also skilled at building fortified encampments and using siege engines to break down city walls. The Great Heathen Army were led by the legendary Viking warriors Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba. Ivar the Boneless was a son of the legendary Viking warrior Ragnar Lothbrok, and is said to have been born with a condition that caused his bones to be very brittle. Despite this, he was a fierce warrior and is believed to have been one of the leaders of the Great Heathen Army. According to legend, he was responsible for the death of the Anglo-Saxon King Olaf, who had killed his father. Halfdan Ragnarsson was also a son of Ragnar Lothbrok and is believed to have been one of the leaders of the Great Heathen Army. He played a key role in the conquest of Northumbria and is said to have been responsible for the death of the Northumbrian king Ecgbert. Ubba was a Danish Viking who also played a key role in leading the Great Heathen Army. He is believed to have been one of the leaders of the Viking forces that attacked East Anglia and is said to have been killed during a battle with the East Anglian king, Edmund. Over the next few years, the Great Heathen Army swept across England, sacking cities and towns and establishing their own settlements. They conquered large areas of England, including the kingdoms of East Anglia, Northumbria, and Mercia, and even threatened Wessex, the last remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdom. The Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia in 865 and quickly conquered the region, including the cities of Norwich and Thetford. In 866, the Great Heathen Army moved north to Northumbria and captured the city of York, which they made into their capital. The Viking conquest of York was a pivotal event in the history of England and the Viking Age. York, also known as Jorvik in Old Norse, was a major Anglo-Saxon city and a center of trade and commerce in the late 9th century. In 866, the city was attacked and captured by a Viking army led by Ivar the Boneless and his brothers Halfdan Ragnarsson and Ubba. The Viking conquest of York began with a surprise attack on the city's walls, which were quickly breached by the Viking army. Once inside the city, the Vikings engaged in a brutal campaign of plunder and destruction, looting churches, monasteries, and other buildings, and killing many of the city's inhabitants. It is believed that Ivar killed King Olaf during this siege. According to legend, Ivar had a personal vendetta against Olaf, who he believed was responsible for the death of his father, the legendary Viking warrior Ragnar Lothbrok. After capturing Olaf, Ivar is said to have subjected him to the ritual of the blood eagle, which is a gruesome form of execution in which the victim's back was opened up to reveal his ribs, which were then broken and pulled out to form the shape of an eagle's wings. This form of execution is widely believed to be fictional, however, and there is little concrete evidence to support its historical accuracy. Over the next several years, the Vikings established a stronghold in York, using the city as a base for further raids and invasions throughout the surrounding region. They built a network of defensive walls and fortifications and established a thriving community that blended Viking and Anglo-Saxon culture. The Viking occupation of York lasted for over a century, during which time the city became a major center of Viking power and culture. The Vikings established trade links with other parts of Europe, and their influence can still be seen today in the city's architecture, language, and cultural traditions. The Great Heathen Army then moved south to Mercia, where they captured the city of Nottingham and attacked other towns such as Derby and Tamworth. In 871, the Great Heathen Army turned its attention to Wessex, the last remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdom. They attacked the city of Reading and then moved west to attack other towns such as Chippenham and Winchester. After the Viking attacks on Wessex, led by the Guthrum the Old, the Anglo-Saxon King Alfred the Great began a campaign to push back against the Viking invaders and defend his kingdom. This period of conflict is known as the Anglo-Saxon Viking War, and it lasted for several decades. The Viking attacks on Wessex began in the 872s, with the city of Reading being captured by the Great Heathen Army in 871. The Vikings then marched westward, attacking and capturing several other towns and cities, including Winchester, the former capital of Wessex. However, they were unable to capture the city of Exeter, which was successfully defended by the Anglo-Saxons. Alfred the Great was able to rally his forces and launch a counter-offensive against the Viking invaders. He fortified his remaining cities and towns and developed new military tactics to counter the Viking threat. He also built a fleet of ships to combat the Viking navy, which had been raiding along the coast. One of Alfred's most significant victories came in 878 when he defeated a large Viking force at the Battle of Edington. The battle was a turning point in the war, and the Vikings were forced to retreat to their stronghold in the north. Alfred then negotiated a peace treaty with the Viking leader Guthrum, which established a boundary between the Anglo-Saxon and Viking territories. Despite the peace treaty, the conflict between the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings continued for several more decades. The Vikings launched several more raids and invasions, and the Anglo-Saxons continued to defend their kingdom in Wessex. The motives behind the Great Heathen Army's invasion are still unclear. Some historians believe that the Vikings were simply raiding for loot and plunder, while others suggest that they were looking to establish permanent settlements in England. There are also theories that the Vikings were seeking revenge for the death of Ragnar Lothbrok, a legendary Viking warrior who was killed by the Anglo-Saxon King Aelle in 865. According to Norse mythology, Ragnar was the father of many great Viking leaders, including Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, and Bjorn Ironside. The exact composition of the Great Heathen Army is also a mystery. Some sources suggest that the army was made up of a mixture of different Viking groups from Scandinavia and other parts of Europe, while others suggest that it was mainly comprised of Danish Vikings. Despite its massive size and conquests, the Great Heathen Army eventually disbanded in the early 10th century. Its leaders and warriors settled in various parts of England, many of them assimilated into Anglo-Saxon society, getting baptized and converting to Christianity. The Great Heathen Army remains a mystery in many ways. Its origins, motives, and composition are still debated by historians, and there is much that is unknown about this massive Viking force that swept across England in the late 9th century.